hit sing whenever you're ready. Happy Friday, everyone. It's good to see you. Happy you're here. We got a lot to talk about as usual. So, missed you last week. It's been a busy season in the Lomax household. Our oldest graduated, and we had a great time celebrating her. And I just want to say at the outset, we won't be here next week because, yes, just that quickly, we'll be moving her to Penn State. So I'm just trying to deal with my own emotions as we make this transition and she starts the next chapter. But we're happy to have you here. And as always, we want to take some time to breathe and remember who we are. So breathe in and out. Breathe in. Breathe out. Breathe in all the goodness the universe has for you and us. Breathe out all the anxiety, stress, craziness. Breathe in all the good and the love. Breathe out all the foolishness. We're going into like for real campaign season, right? Biden, Harris, and all that stuff. So the next several months are going to be interesting. And I think it's even more important that we take time to just breathe and remember. As is our practice, I'll play the ancestral drum call, and we invite you to put your ancestors' names in the chat, and we will call them and say Ashe. Ashe. So we got some folks.
Ernestine Cox.
Ernestine Cox, Ashe.
Willis D. Sanders Jr.
Willis D. Sanders Jr., Ashe.
Evely Sanders.
Evely Sanders, Ashe.
William Taylor Sr.
William Taylor Sr., Ashe.
Charles Bell.
Charles Bell, Ashe.
Mike Bell.
Mike Bell, Ashe.
Danielle Bell.
Danielle Bell, Ashe.
William Bell.
William Bell, Ashe.
George Bell.
George Bell, Ashe.
Ed Bell.
Ed Bell, Ashe.
Edna Bell.
Edna Bell, Ashe.
Patricia Bell.
Patricia Bell, Ashe. Asheo. We remember, again, our ancestors because, I mean, in this time, if we don't remember who we are, we're going to get lost. It's crazy. The federal, the Department of Justice, I just saw, is accusing Yale of discriminating against white people and Asians. How does a white school discriminate against white people and Asians, which, for all intents and purposes, has become a model minority? The game is changing, so we have to remember who we are and why we're here. Today, I wanted to talk about what happens when we place humanity at the center of our politics. Last time we were together, we examined whiteness, and we made the case that whiteness is a pathology. It's a sickness, and it's the reason why the world is out of balance, right? It's a relatively new thing, and it has given birth to all of these things that we experience in America and around the world that have led to global warming, that has led to, chattel slavery. All of these negative things that still impact us today is a result of being out of balance. And that didn't happen until Europe came to the fore as a world power collectively. So whiteness or Eurocentric values, aesthetics, is really what has shifted the balance from being in balance in a humane way with each other and the world. There's always been conflict, there's always been strife, there's always been power struggles, but in general, balance to where we are now, right? Profits over people and the like. So I want to talk about or just discuss with you, what happens when we actually see the forest for the trees, right? There's that colloquialism that says you can't see the forest for the trees, but what happens when we're able to put humanity at the center of our politics and we learn to see the forest for the trees? Right? So we're flipping that colloquialism on its head. What made me start thinking about this is Andrew Yang. So I was in the Yang gang, right? And a lot of people thought I was crazy. Not only was he an Asian dude, which in a racist country is not cool, but he was talking all this stuff, universal basic income, Medicaid for all, free college, all this stuff. And people were like, he's crazy. He's so far left. He's smart, but he's crazy. He won't win. But what's interesting is as COVID really started to be what it has become, the ideas that he was talking about in the fall of 2019, many of them started to take center stage. And because of that, I started to think about what would have happened if we take his tagline, humanity first, and really started to put humanity at the center of our political discourse, right? And so I was like, so he's saying humanity forward, humanity first. Maybe, because I forgot, it's been a few months, maybe that's what he was doing. Maybe that's what he was trying to do. So I went to his campaign website, which is still up, and I started reading through. And, it's interesting. His website had a lot of good stuff, but it started to bother me. And I wanted to kind of use that as context for the discussion today. His Yang Gang Humanity First website was his presidential website, and his campaign was really about, like I said, universal basic income, free college, Medicare for all, and what he calls human-centered capitalism, which is a concept that he really discusses in his book, The War on Normal People. In that book, he outlines 3 central tenets of human-centered capitalism, right? Keep that term, human-centered capitalism. The first tenet is that humans are more important than money. The unit of a human capitalism economy is each person, not each dollar. I did not misspeak. It started with human-centered capitalism, and then the language shifts to human capitalism. Put a plug in that, right? So humans are more important than money. A unit of human capital of a human capitalism economy is each person, not each dollar. And 3, markets exist to serve common goals and values to maximize human welfare. Those are the 3 tenets, right? So far so good, except for what I first thought was a typo, right? It starts with human-centered capitalism, and then it goes to human capitalism. That was a typo, except it keeps getting repeated, right? It keeps getting repeated. It never really goes back to human-centered capitalism. It starts there, but then it shifts almost in the very next sentence to human capitalism, right? The more I read, the more that became a significant shift, and I'll share why. So Yang argues on his website and in the book that the problem with the current approach to capitalism, referred to as corporatism or institutional capitalism, is that it systematically, quote, systematically tends to undervalue many things, activities, and people, many of which are core to the human experience, right? So far, so good. But while I understand and appreciate what Yang was trying to do in the major political discourse of a presidential campaign, I have a few issues of the subtext, right? In the subtext, what really caught me about that was that language shift from human-centered to human capitalism, right? Number 1, Yang suggests that we upgrade, quote unquote, from a market economy, an economy where supply and demand dictates the production of goods and services and prices, to a human-centered capitalism, or human capitalism for short. That's a direct quote. Human capitalism for short, right? Problem number 1 with that, no matter how you spin it, there's a huge difference between human-centered capitalism and human capitalism in a country where humans were once capital, right? And we can attribute this to a lot of things. We could say well-intentioned, ignorance, all this other kind of stuff. But you cannot live in America for any amount of time and not remember or know or any way be aware of the fact that slavery is the way that America became a wealthy nation. And so is this a slip of the tongue? Is this a typo? Or is he signaling something to a certain group of people when he drops the centered, hyphen centered, from the phrase human-centered capitalism? Because the implications are dire and distressing in status quo if it's purposeful to shorten human-centered capitalism to just human capitalism, right? Human capital is what poor white people, white women, First Nation folks, and African descended people, and people of color in general, except for quote unquote favored minorities, have been since before America was a thing, right? So that's the first problem. Secondly, capitalism, even at its most quote unquote human-centered, and where it created, the social safety net, Social Security, Medicaid, and everything, was still never intended to become an economic or political system that favored inclusion. Why do I say that? Because when I looked up capitalism, and I had to just to be clear, because I was still wrestling with that human-centered capitalism versus human capitalism. So I looked up capitalism, and the definition I found several, and they all said essentially this, that capitalism is an economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by the I can't read my handwriting. Controlled by private owners rather than the state for profit, right? So that means individuals can own corporations that dictate the economy and political agenda for their personal profit, not that of the state. That's very interesting, huh? Because if capitalism was always intended to be both an economic and political system for the profit of individuals and not the whole, then how can we argue that capitalism, no matter how we frame it, it can be and should be inclusive, right? What do they call some folks? Compassionate conservatives. There's no such thing as a compassionate capitalist. Even as we have phrases like human-centered capitalism or some of the new, approaches to capitalism that we see with Patagonia and other such companies that are trying to do things like buy one, get one. So if you buy an overly priced pair of shoes or whatever from Patagonia or Tom's shoes, they give one away to someone who can't afford it, right? That's supposed to be conscious capitalism, right? Compassionate capitalism. But at its very foundation, the bones, the DNA of capitalism is exploitative. It is not inclusive because capitalism is an economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit rather than the state. So it makes sense that since the 40s, we have evolved in our political discourse from talking about each other as neighbors, the way Toni Morrison describes, to now discussing individuals as shareholders, right? Neighbors are people who add value to each other because we value each other, right? If I'm a good neighbor and you're a good neighbor, that means if I need anything from a cup of coffee to somebody to babysit my kids, you are there for me and it's reciprocated. But if I am a shareholder, my only responsibility to the group is to extract as much as I can, as many resources as I can, and make a new investment to then extract more resources. You see the difference? So in a capitalist society that made its wealth on slavery, human capital, right? Human-centered capitalism still is problematic because of what capitalism was originally intended to be. Right? And then dropping this hyphen centered from that phrase is even more problematic because now it harkens back to the exploitation of human beings in the American system. Yeah. Number 3 problem. An economic system that centers humanity while also allowing for the growth of individual and collective wealth is really socialism. So it sounds like folks who think economically the same way Yang does are really trying to figure out ways to engage socialist principles without using the word socialism because, frankly, Americans are too dumb to understand what socialism really is, right? And it's not their fault. That stupidity, and in some cases willful ignorance, is because Americans have not been educated well. And the reason why Americans have not been educated well, unless you can afford to go to private school, and that's a whole different thing, is because an educated populace is a populace that is relatively free, right? My favorite slave owner said, when the government is afraid, Thomas Jefferson is my favorite slave owner, said when the government is afraid of the people, there will be liberty. But when the people are afraid of the government, there will be tyranny, right? The only way the government can be afraid of the people is if we have an educated populace, right? Because more often than not, the hope is that an educated populace holds its elected officials accountable. Whereas the populace that we currently have gives us something that can only be made in America, and that is yours truly, Donald J. Trump. He is your president, America. You elected him. I can get away with that because I've not been fully enfranchised. So I'm not technically America. So he's your problem, right? We all have to deal with him. But that is the result of the last 50 years or so of oppression, repression, and suppression due to education inequality, wealth inequality, and all of the other isms that stem from that. That is, again, the result of a capitalist society, right? So Andrew Yang, human-centered capitalism sounds great, but when you start to dig deeper into those ideas and the ideals around those 3 tenets, it starts to fall apart. I'm going to play something else, and then we'll talk more about socialism and capitalism.
Ancestor, Vernon Lomax.
Oh, we got another ancestor. Vernon Lomax, Ashe. Ashe-o. All right. So, Yang and others, Bernie Sanders, and many other people on the so-called left, right? Mind you, the left and the right are still attached to the same blade, right? But at any rate, what Yang is really getting at, to me, is and the same thing that Bernie is, except Bernie admits to a certain extent that he's a democratic socialist. But Yang is trying to use the language of capitalism to, in some ways, bring in socialist ideas, except for the fact that when you drop hyphen-centered from a human-centered capitalist concept, it really doesn't sound good and it doesn't look good and it doesn't bode well for people like me who are aware of the fact that slavery existed, exploitation still exists in America. Prison industrial complexes, slavery as a different name. And that is a context where right now, people, human beings, are more important than dollars, because the more inmates you have, the more work can get done, the more you can charge for that work, and the more money you can make if you're a private prison, right? That's human-centered economy, or a human capitalist economy, right? So we have to be very careful when we talk about this. If you think about socialism, now it allows, it allows an individual to generate resources with the community, where capitalism, the resources are generated at the expense of the community, right? It's individual only. This is individual and, right? The community is in mind beyond one's own needs, but depending on how it's implemented, socialism does not preclude you or I as individuals from earning more or less than our neighbors, right? So it's not the way it's been kind of touted or described in a negative sense in mainstream political discourse, right? Economists will argue that because capitalism, in the way that we understand it now, has generated so much wealth, trillions and trillions of dollars of wealth, and socialism, communism, all these other forms of economic and political frameworks have not been as successful, then capitalism won the political ideal or the argument, right? But I would argue it only won because of the Eurocentric values that are individualistic, as opposed to other countries or even ethnic sensibilities. I'm thinking about African-centered ideas that are communal, right? When you have the most swords or the most muskets or the most rockets or the most tanks, whatever you choose, you're going to be able to implement and deploy throughout the world because you can do it at the barrel of a gun or the tip of a spear, right? The thing about communal societies, for the most part, is in history, very few, if any, spent as much time on war as Europe did, right? So it's not so much that Europe is better, smarter, but it is more militaristic, more violent, and less humane as a result, right? So when you are in a position to generate resources with the mentality that your resources support you and your community, that is human-centered, right? Because there's no exploitation there, right? If the point is to generate resources to support you and your community, then you have to, by default, work in community to generate those resources and to make sure everyone's needs are met, right? Capitalism obviously doesn't have to do that, right? Because we have people who are making billions of dollars right now while we have other folks that are hungry. Period, point blank. They're on the street. They're waiting on any of us to drive up to the corner and hand them a few bucks so they can get to work, right? Even bucks. It's a capitalistic term, right? It slipped out of my mouth because I've been socialized in this American construct. But buck really refers to human capital. There it is right there, right? And I'm aware of this stuff. So if I'm still dealing with it, what about people who are ignorant or willfully so? You understand what I'm saying? That's how ingrained this pathology is in all of us. So it begs the question then, you know, what happens when we place humanity at the center of our politics and by extension at the center of our economics without exploitation, right? Well, we haven't done it yet. in the modern era. So that remains to be seen in terms of what will happen. But here's how I think we can do it, right? When we place humanity at the center of our political and economic thinking and doing, we return to balance, or the ancient Kemetic notion of ma'at, divine balance, right? Ma'at is the ancient Kemetic concept of divine order, represented as a winged goddess. This notion of truth, order, balance, and even justice was taken so seriously that it was said one couldn't enter the afterlife unless your heart was lighter than a feather. And the way you got to that point was you followed the 42 negative confessions, right? I have not, I have not, I have not. And it's all kind of stuff. From I have not, stolen anything or hurt anybody without defending, just because, to, I have prayed. I mean, it's all kind of things. It really identifies, and I could read them all off. We just don't have time. It identifies touches every aspect of human beingness, right? And if you want to read them, all you have to do is Google the 42 laws of Ma'at, M-A-A-T, and they're all right there, right? So Ma'at is an ancient African, Kemetic, Egypt notion of divine order and balance that held the center of who we were as a people, as human beings. And for the tens and even maybe hundreds of thousands of years that Ma'at ruled the world, because Kemet was the center of culture, learning, and military in the world for several millennia, right? We were in balance. There was no global warming. They had technology, but there was no global warming, right? They had ideas or practices that we would today call slavery, but it was nothing like chattel slavery, right? There's much evidence of people who were, quote unquote, enslaved, who rose to be generals in the military, who rose to be very important people in society. And we only have a few examples of those in America who did that during slavery, right? Frederick Douglass rose to prominence during slavery, but he had to escape. He had to beat up his master and run away. These folks in the African context, especially Kemet, they didn't have to escape, right? Because their humanity was centered. Their humanity was centered. And they were servants, but I think a lot of times people want to put that word slave on that construct or that notion of servitude, because it tends to, in their minds, justify European slave trades, chattel slavery. That's not true. The word slave comes from Slav, because Europe has always had a slave trade, and those in the Slavic countries were the primary source of enslaved peoples in Europe. Check out the history. You don't have to come to me. You don't have to believe me. Just go check it out. Google it, right? We didn't have that word, slave, because we were centering humanity as a result of this practice of Ma'at. And so what I can think of in terms of what it looks like is what it probably looked like back then, right? We made stuff that nobody can figure out how to make because we were focused on working together, right? We created artwork. We created science. We created notions of God. We did all of these great things that still inform every aspect of human activity today because we were more focused on each other and making our connection with the universe more real every day than we were on war. That's what you can do when you're focused on our collective humanity. You can live in balance with the earth. You can live in balance with each other, right? There are stories of quote unquote battles, war happening all over Africa, and one person died or got hurt and the war was over because the cost of human life was too high. When's the last time you heard of any European war stopping because one person broke their leg or got killed? So it's really interesting when we think about Chicago and other places, and people always want to say, well, black people or the N-words or whatever, they don't value each other. They're just animals. Da, da, da. Where did we learn that from? Because that's not how we behaved before colonialism, before the slave trade. We learned that from you, white folk. We learned that from you, Europe. because there's never been a time when Europe was not at war. Just like there's never been a time when America was not at war. Maybe like 20 years, right? We've been, look it up. Just Google how many years has America been at war, and it will be staggering. Because that's how we drive our economy now. That's how we continue to be an imperial power in the world, right? We have more than twice the amount of military bases around the world than any other nation because we are constantly, perpetually at war. It's because the Eurocentric values that govern this nation are base values. They're not humane. We've never had humanity at the center of any of our political, economic, or interpersonal practices. But you have a civilization that lasted for hundreds of thousands of years prior to its fall to Alexander the Greek at the decline of that civilization, right? Not at the height. We were never out of balance. We created things, again, that even with all the computer power we have now, folks can't understand how it happened. So Ma'at is that glue that held people together. It governed how we behaved. We didn't need religion because we understood our connection to the divine, right? So our practice in the way that we would understand religion then was to just be every day. It didn't happen on Sunday. It didn't happen on Friday. It didn't happen on Saturday. It happened daily, right? The Dogon, just drawing a pail of water, understood what the ripple effect of that meant in a cosmic context, as well as a spiritual context, cosmic being science, as well as a spiritual context in mathematics and everything else, because everything was connected, right? When you deal with a human-centered concept, you then are connected to everything and everyone. And it makes it much more difficult to be inhumane, because to treat someone inhumanely, to develop policy, procedures, practices, infrastructure, systems that perpetually treat and by default treat people inhumanely is to hurt yourself. But something happened. Read Iceman Inheritance. Something happened with the Ice Age that caused what became Europe to not be as human as everyone else. There's a sliver there. You find some individuals, but holistically, the culture is inhumane, right? So the world has been out of balance to that point so long, we don't know what it feels like. All we can do is look back to these ancient civilizations and imagine, right? We could argue that the world began to go out of balance, like I said, when Alexander the Greek conquered a greatly diminished Kemet. Others could argue that divine order began to slip away as Europe came to be a global power in the late 15th and 16th centuries. Whenever or however you date the beginning of the end of the divine order and balance on Earth, it all points back to Europe, right? Because that's where we are right now and why we are where we are. The global evidence is very clear. Again, global warming, right? I made a list. I'm looking at slavery, death, destruction of various cultures, the lies of supremacy, domination, are all Eurocentric values, right? We could just go on. Name any ism that's negative. Racism, sexism, classism, genderism, all of that is a Eurocentric value in the way that it's practiced now, right? Nobody's ever been perfect, I'm not saying that. But as a core value, that is Eurocentric, right? That's how white folk in America and across Europe have behaved for centuries, right? And America has taken it to heights unknown. We perfected chattel slavery. Everything we do now, from accounting to factories to common business practices, came out of slavery. Without slavery, there is no America, right? And then I got proof around the world. We don't have to go through there. We just did that. Domestic evidence, 45, Black Lives Matter, the racial wealth gap, general wealth inequalities, the prison industrial complex, inequitable public education, inequitable health care, the USDA, right? Because our food sources are not healthy just because the Supreme Court, Congress, the gender pay gap, all these things point to inhumane practices, policies, procedures, infrastructure, systems meant to privilege a few over the many, right? So I'm going to play something, and then we're going to talk about how we bring balance back. All right. So, capitalism, socialism, ma'at, evidence for why Eurocentric values have really thrown us out of divine order. So how do we fix this? How does humanity return to balance? And specifically, how does America find balance, right? Well, first we have to substantively and transformatively confront and address the nation's original sins. Slavery, the veritable genocide of First Nation peoples, and the disenfranchisement of poor white men and the complete disenfranchisement of white women, right? Again, and from a exploitative, feudal perspective, people without resources, no matter what they look like, are not valued, right? People are always like, oh, you're Afrocentric or you're militant or whatever. Why are you always throwing white women and white men in there? Because they've been exploited just like everybody else. Just check out the story of John Punch, right? Just go Google John Punch, Virginia, and you'll see what I mean. So whatever the United States was supposed to be, it was never intended to be inclusive of these folks. Yet the rhetoric of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness has cast a powerful spell on everyone. So we have to break that spell. We have to wake up. That's why people are saying, I'm woke, I'm trying to get woke, because the American dream keeps us all asleep, right? And as soon as you wake up, you're like Neo in the Matrix, and you're looking, you're like, yo, I didn't see all of this. But that's what it really is, right? This American dream is a spell that's cast on the whole world. Makes everybody think that the streets are lined with gold and all that kind of stuff. And they get here, and if you have a geopolitical state from which you come, you have opportunity for economic advancement, no matter what you look like. Because America is first and foremost capitalist, meaning money. But if you get darker on the spectrum of color, it gets harder for you, right? And if you are like me and so many others that descend from enslaved Africans, the barriers are in many cases insurmountable. Not impossible, but in many cases insurmountable, right? Because somebody has to lose in America, right? So putting human beings at the center of American politics means reconciling with the three original sins. Like I said, America has been at war since before it was born. The country was birthed from war and chaos, and it knows nothing else. So we have to shift that vibration, right? This is about consciousness as much as it is about practice, right? In a war-focused nation, America goes to war with everything and everyone. And it wins very little of the wars that it causes or declares on cultural issues. They know how to shoot people. They don't know how to heal people, right? Think about it. The war on drugs exacerbated the drug problem. I think that's what it was intended to do. Anything else domestically that we've declared war on, we lose. Just go down the list, any of it, right? War on poverty. There's more poverty now than ever, right? War on crime. We've got more people in prison and still a lot of crime by comparison, right? Policing does not, over-policing, policing in general does not decrease crime because police happen after the fact, right? You call the police after something's happened. You don't call the police before something's happened. And more often than not, if you're in a community of color, calling the police is a life-threatening action, right? So more police, hyper-militarized police did not bring crime levels down. What keeps crime where it is an inequitable society, right? Because we are at war with poor people as a society. So we have to shift that vibration from war to humanity, right? Shift the consciousness from always being at odds and in battle, strife, to being at peace, harmony, balance. That's why we can't solve any of these problems, because we are trying to fight ourselves with methods that are meant to kill people And so America will continue to die on the sword of capitalism, die on the sword of racism, because it just wants to throw money and throw platitudes when really it needs to shift its spiritual consciousness from a war mentality to a balanced mentality, a peace mentality, right? Divine order. In ancient biblical times, this practice was called the way, right? And there's even evidence in my research that this phrase, the way, was used in ancient Kemet. The way was the path to peace, the path to divine order, harmony, enlightenment, whatever what you want to use. It was the path to become your optimized human self, right? So what would happen if America shifted its vibration, its consciousness from a place of war and unrest to a place of balance and harmony and rest? What if we actually taught students what it meant to be healthy, happy, and whole human beings? What if we actually invested more resources in education, housing, basic needs for those who need that than we did in the military? What if we redirected and redistributed wealth so that there was more equality? Not saying that if you work hard and you create a business and you become Apple, we're going to take everything from you. No, you did that work, you deserve it. But you don't deserve it just because you're white. You don't deserve it at the expense of other people in your community. To be a true meritocracy means that we cannot set the deck for certain groups of people and let the other ones just fend for themselves, right? That's human-centeredness, right? Equity, not equality. Neither America nor the world can return to balance until we realize that being human is the most important goal we can have. It is our humanity that connects us to others. It is our humanity that connects us to the planet and to all the life that exists here. It is our humanity that connects us to the universe because we are the universe. We are this planet and we are each other. We are the forest. As soon as we begin to see the forest and be the forest, the trees will again be able to be all they were meant to be. What happens when we are the forest for the trees? That's when we figure that out, we'll know that we've put humanity at the center of our politics and economics, right? If the forest is for the trees, and the trees are the forest, then I am because you are, and because you are, I am. See that? We just went from this individualistic, Eurocentric perspective all the way 180 to an Afrocentric, communal perspective. And like Stokely Carmichael said, power begins at the point of conception. As soon as we believe that we can do this, it's done. All we got to do is put the legwork, right? Frederick Douglass said, I prayed for freedom for 22 years, but it wasn't until I prayed with my feet that I got free. He had to first believe that he could do it, and then he moved, right? The reason why we haven't solved these problems is because most of America believes these problems either are as they should be or are overwhelmed and they don't feel like we can solve the problems. That's just not true. It starts with a shift in perspective, which leads to a shift in consciousness. Because when you start to see things differently, just like Neo in the Matrix, you start to engage the environment differently. The more you engage the environment from that new perspective, the more you grow in consciousness in that perspective, and the more that becomes your reality. So it is always about what future do you want to see? And what changes do you and I have to make in ourselves to bring about that reality? How do we manifest that? Through working inside out. The innerverse is where it all happens. Eurocentric is all about material, extrapolating resources from people at their expense so we can gain material wealth, which means nothing. Afrocentric values are about inside out. I am because you are. We are the forest. My being a tree, you being a tree, means that we're creating this beautiful canopy, right? Ashe. I'm going to play us out. I'll see you in 2 weeks. We've got materials, as always, curriculum, the suite. On the 25th, we're releasing a new album called The Last Concert. It's a live recording from our last concert before COVID hit. You can pre-order that at any time from my website. You can get it on Spotify and all the major streaming services. And Ruth and I are working on the next episode of the Drumversations podcast. So be sure to check that out on iTunes, Spotify, and SoundCloud. All right? Cool. See y'all in 2 weeks.